Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we have my friend Boaz Avraham-Katz here with us on the podcast. Boaz is the senior Jewish educator for Elon University and also teaches in the Jewish Studies department and specifically teaches a lot of classes about Jews and the intersection with food. So Boaz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
I actually had to eat breakfast before we recorded today because I figured I would get hungry if I just talked about food for about an hour without eating. Tracing back the history, it strikes me, I was thinking about food a lot this weekend, in preparation for this podcast. Most of what one considers to be Jewish food, say in 2024, is probably only about 150, 200 years old, right? I don't believe if you took a time machine back 1,000 years to either Iraq or Poland, you would recognize any of the normal cuisines at a Shabbat dinner. Do you have some sense of at what point in history can we even start to trace something called the Jewish food? When does that make sense? Does anyone sort of have answers to this?
So I don't know if we have answers to this, but I'm going to go back to the sources. The first time we hear about food or we know about food is very much during Mishnaic times where, I don't know if you've ever been to that interesting place in Israel called Neot Kdumim. There's a wonderful exhibition there of Sukkot and different things. And this is also where for the first time we're introduced to what Jews ate during biblical time. And I will say, not amazing, not great food at all. It was rather simple. Meat wasn't consumed. Meat was only consumed for special occasions because, meat or sheep or all these different things were considered collateral, were considered what you owned, and so you only used it if there was a special occasion and if you could consume it in one go, because you could not leave anything behind. Everything needed to be used. So we hear about meat only eaten at special occasions. Think Abraham as an example. He is so excited he makes food for the people who are coming to visit him. So that's one thing. And then it is very much very simple food. Cheese that was produced from the milk of goats or maybe cows. We know about, I call it biblical popcorn, which was basically stems of wheat who were put on fire and heated up, okay, and then were consumed like that. Bread, quite terrible wine, I will say. It was rather more like a vinegar kind of thing. So that's the first time we hear about sort of like biblical foods or foods like this.
And would this have been different? I mean, I'm sure that this is very hard to know historically, but how different would this have been to, say the Babylonian and Persian neighbors? I mean, on the one hand, clearly just halachically, obviously Jews were not eating pork already from, early, before recorded history in Jewish history, obviously not meat and milk and other things like that. And so already Jews probably had to, come up with some sort of their own cuisine, but I'm guessing the sort of staples, the bread, cheese, wine.
Yeah, and I thought, they were very much what we call terroir. They ate what they grew. So if it was wheat, so we see a lot of the use of wheat. Some is made into what they call, and in the Bible, I think, if I'm not mistaken, talks about matzah, which was the simplest way of making bread. Bread is made, used on a regular basis. Fruits were used, whatever was grown. So I would say whatever was grown, that was eaten, And so maybe the Babylonians and everybody else ate maybe different things depending on what they grew. But I would say that the Jewish diet or the biblical diet was a very simple diet.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it strikes me, just as sort of somewhat of a comedic aside, that really the majority of the time, at least, the Torah talks about food, specifically the book of Exodus here, it's Jews complaining about food. I mean, there must be at least 5 or 6 times during the trek through the desert that the Israelites, right? They're describing, they're basically saying, this is terrible. We want. We want the melons of Egypt. We want the fish in Egypt. We want meat. We need
Yeah,
bananas.
exactly. Take us back to the meat pots of Egypt. Yeah, very short, short memory we have, the Jewish people. Look, in the desert, they were given manna, which we don't know what that exactly means. Some say, some rabbinic interpretation talks that whatever you wanted it to be, it became, right? And then there was slav, which were these little birds, which really were protein. So you know what? You were given protein, you were given some kind of a different food, and that's what you used. What we're going to see later on, that Jews find themselves in a situation when they are finally moving, okay, and they are moving into different places, that they're introduced to different types of food, and they're introduced to different types of things, and they adopt and adapt. So these are two things we need to talk about. So
Got it. Okay, so
adopting,
I'm excited. So let's stay chronologically. It strikes me you opened up with talking about the Mishnaic period, just for listeners' background, right? Roughly 0 to, let's say, 250, 300 CE. This is during the decentralizing era of Jewish history. The Talmud, which is the Mishnah and Gemara, just for listeners, 0 to 600. The Talmud talks a lot about food, but not because it cares necessarily about food, but food is sort of a proxy of talking about Jewish law. And it strikes me that a lot of the most important Jewish foods are specifically ones that are eaten on Shabbat and holidays. And just for, Shabbat rules 101 for listeners, just in case, right? One of the main rules of Shabbat is you're not allowed to light a fire and you're not allowed to cook, which, again, if you want to have a warm meal, say on Saturday afternoon, right? You have these long Shabbats that, end at 9 p.m. And so let's say 3 p.m. you want to have, a nice stew. You actually have to concoct foods that either stay warm or able to remain on the coals or on the fire, overnight without burning. And so, it never really dawned on me to think about this from a food historical perspective, because, the sort of nerdy, rabbinic Jew in me is always thinking about this from a halachic or Jewish legal perspective. But it does strike me that, Jews might have utilized stews. I mean, now, of course, everybody's heard of either cholent in the Ashkenazi sense or chamin in the Mizrahi Sephardic sense. But that probably was because of some sort of, legal importance of, if I were to serve you a steak on Saturday afternoon, right, I can't keep that warm all night. And, chicken, I can't keep that warm. But if it's stew, I could just keep adding in extra water, right, before Shabbat. Of course, you can't add in water on Shabbat. But I add in an extra gallon of water before Shabbat and know that by the time I serve it, 17 hours later, it'll still be, nice and fresh.
And not only that, so when Jews moved, okay, they looked around and said, okay, so what can we do, or what can we use, that we can, as I said, adopt and adapt. So when they moved into different places, let's say, for example, a good example would be the Jews who lived in it, who came straight from Jerusalem to Italy, to Rome. We talk about Jews, Italian Jews that are neither Ashkenazi nor Sephardic. They are a group on their own. They looked around and they said, wait a minute, what can we do that makes us, so we can't eat pork. Okay, so of course, one of the biggest things that they make in Italy is prosciutto. So what do I do with prosciutto? I'll come up with a different version of it. So they made a version made out of geese. Okay. And it's, by the way, a delicacy and still can be eaten. It sort of went into the Italian vocabulary, food vocabulary, as something that people ate. So what Jews basically did in many situations, we need to understand that to a large degree, Jewish food was not a food of luxury. It was a food of poverty. And if you look at, and one of the biggest things that Jewish households always did, and in this case, it was women who had to come up with ideas of how to stretch the food, how to make it, how can they feed their families. And so what we see mainly when Jews moved to the Rhine area, or when they moved to France and Germany, but then moved to Poland and later on to Russia, And we have this idea of the Pale of Settlement, or what we now know as the shtetl, as an example. Okay. You were right by saying that Shabbat plays a super important role in the food preparation. So the whole time, a Jew muddled through the week, tried to figure out by feeding the family bread and any kind of a carb. Okay, we see a lot of potatoes and a lot of oats and all these different things. And on Shabbat, everything went towards Shabbat. Okay, if you think about the famous or infamous gefilte fish, okay, what was the gefilte fish made out of? It was made out of carp, which was the simplest of fish. It was the cheapest fish available. And by stuffing it, by doing all these different things, you stretched it.
Mm.
On Shabbat, you ate, or the idea was to eat like a king. Chicken, maybe a piece of meat. The cholent, by the way, which was prepared on Friday afternoon and taken into each shtetl had a communal oven, and the food was brought to the communal oven, okay, and the cholent, by the way, a word that comes from French, chaland, hot, okay. And what they basically did, whatever you had, you added. So people added potatoes and wheat and things. And if you were lucky, you had a piece of meat or a piece of fat that you put in there to make it. So the cholents were different depending on what you were able to do.
Yeah, and of course you would throw in, whatever intestines, right? That's where kishka comes in, right?
Exactly. And you stuff it with wheat, and it's a nice, again, think about this, Daniel, especially when we talk about Ashkenazi cuisine in the Pale of Settlement, Russia, the Russian Empire, Poland, places like this. Carbs, 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 very important. It's cold. The other thing that many people did as well, they gathered. They were people who went and found mushrooms and found a sorrel, for example, is something, and you made a sorrel soup out of it, and you made all kinds of things. So you needed to be very crafty and very able to figure out what to feed your family. So that even, during the week, there weren't really meals per se. You got some kind of an oatmeal or some kind of or grits or whatever they had, and you ate that, okay? But, so what's really important is something very amazing happens when the Jews leave.
Wait, can we just pause on the Pale Settlement?
Sure.
Because the immigration to America, I'm very excited to talk about. I think I actually called you last summer, just for listeners to know. I taught an American Jewish history class last year. So I called you last summer and asked you a bunch of questions in preparation for a class on Ashkenazi food coming to the America. So we'll get there in a couple minutes. I just want to dig down in this Pale of Settlement period. So you talked about poverty being part of the food selection. You talked about Jewish law, right? Halachic requirements, Shabbat, right? No pork. It also strikes me there's probably a third factor that developed, that helped food development, namely anti-Semitism. And I don't mean just the fact that, of course, anti-Semitism was the whole reason for the Pale of Settlement and the shtetl. And, if we talk about other places in Western Europe, the ghetto in the first place, but say the history of the bagel, right? A lot of historians believe the history of a bagel, right? Real bagels, not, the bagels that you get, in the shopping mall at, somewhere in Orange County, but real bagels are boiled, not baked. And, this isn't, because it was some act of culinary genius by a bunch of Ashkenazi Jews in the 1800s. This was because Jews actually had anti-Semitic laws prohibiting their use of ovens in a lot of cases, probably due to conspiracy theories about, killing Christian babies and everything there. And so in a lot of cases, this was actually forced innovation based off of anti-Semitism, which I think is fascinating, right? I'm sure a whole host of other foods fit that bill also.
Not only that, there was in the Pale of Settlement, as an example, there was a law called the Koropka, which was basically there was a special tax on kosher meat that you needed to pay in order for you to get kosher meat. So you can imagine that when your budget doesn't always allow it. So you don't eat meat. You eat meat only once a week. You eat meat whenever that's available, or for chagim, or for the holidays, or for things like that. But you really are limited in what you can eat. So, so there was as I said, a lot of wheat, a lot of things like that was available. Also, many of the Jews who lived in the Pale of Settlement were farmers. They farmed, So there was milk available. I don't need to remind you about Fiddler on the Roof as an example, where we see that, he's a milkman, and there's meat and there's cheese. And so there were certain things that were readily available. But when it came to the high proteins, we must also remember one thing before I say all of this. There was a clear hierarchy, a clear social hierarchy. There were those who have, and there was a very few of them. The majority of the people really were in different stages of poverty, and it was very difficult to, there was no upward mobility. You couldn't, change and become something. You were basically stuck in your social standing, and it will only be once they immigrate that things like that are going to change.
Yeah, well, it does dawn on me, right? Let's take the 1800s, because that was such an interesting period of historic change in the Pale of Settlement. The early 1800s is, of course, before most of the people leave and come to the Americas. You did have this era of, burgeoning socialism, and then later on Zionism and secularism, and then, interjected all with, this culmination of Messianism, in the Hasidic movement. And so the, late 1700s to the mid to late 1800s is an era where I think a lot of Jews were looking around in Eastern Europe, trying to change this sort of social order that in some way seems like it was frozen in time for hundreds of years. Whether or not that was successful is a whole other question. There's a really interesting analysis of Jewish socialists in the Pale of Settlement, and one of the things that never really dawned on me, and this is in Irving Howard's The World of Our Fathers, right? A fascinating book about I might have butchered the name, Irving Howe, something like that. He wrote sort of the book. It's, about 1,000 pages for anybody interested about this Eastern European community that migrates to America. It's a fascinating book. I strongly recommend it to listeners who are interested in this. What he says about socialism was that a lot of times it was not really a practical socialism, because Jews actually had very little interaction with non-Jews, and all the Jews that were talking about it were poor. So you take a group of 15 people that are all in abject poverty, and everybody agrees to be socialist, and then you go home and you still don't have anything to split.
What do I do with it?
Yeah. And so it was only actually with the two, big breakoff movements, right? One, Zionism, right? And of course, the early kibbutzim and early Zionist movement was actual socialist. And the second in America, where a lot of these socialistic Jews entered politics, created labor unions, right? Everything that we sort of know from that direction.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this is, what I find interesting is that one of the things that this, secularism and all these things added to is that so the first way to move was to move away from the shtetls into bigger cities. And they do this, once there is emancipation and there's a little bit more of that, people move into, from the shtetl to, say, for example, Warsaw or places like this, where they're trying to find a better life for them, for themselves, and things change. But I would say that again, Warsaw was filled with people who did not have the means, who were day laborers, who were trying to eke out an existence. Nothing is going to change until, a very dramatic and drastic step is going to be taken, which will be immigration.
Yeah, so setting the stage for immigration, and then it'll be all you in terms of the food. Just for listeners' background, the 1880s is really the beginning of this major Eastern European immigration to the Americas. Of course, there was already a reasonably sized Jewish community here already in America, full of initially Sephardic Jews, and then later on in the mid 1800s, Germanic Jews who were sort of fleeing the Napoleonic Wars. But it was really the 1880s that the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews have at least one or two, oftentimes three or four great grandparents that came between 1880 and World War I. Certainly a lot of my grandparents came during that era, and this was mostly as a result of fleeing the pogroms that had also broken out in Eastern Europe in the late 1880s. And this is, of course, also for, we keep referencing Fiddler on the Roof, which is, it's almost impossible to have this conversation without it, right? At the end of Fiddler on the Roof, right, you hear Tevye, scream out to one of his neighbors, we'll be, with Uncle blah, blah, blah in Chicago. And, that really is the story of the vast
We're
majority.
We're going to be neighbors without
exactly.
even understanding the, yes.
Chicago to New York. Yeah. So we had this massive immigration. About 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe come to the Americas throughout that really 30 or 40 years. Set the stage, culinary wise. What's going on?
So what's interesting about this is that this was what happened to immigrants, or what happened to what immigration did. It created some kind of a trauma, because if in the shtetl, although not great, things were very sorted. The rabbi had the authority. He told what, he was, you didn't know what to do. You went to the rabbi. You didn't know what to do. You went, there were all kinds of institutions. And when you come to America, okay, again, you don't come into riches. You come into poverty. You're going to the tenements in Lower East Side. You start living in tenements, 20 people. You do all kinds of piecework, which is work, you create, in the garment industry and so on and so forth. But you earn better wages. And these better wages change the way Jews eat. Because if a Jew worked towards Shabbat in the shtetl, because that's what they wanted to do, they wanted to eat, there's a new, we are introduced to a new concept. Every day is Shabbos. Every day is Friday night. Why? Because all of a sudden, you are able to buy chicken or beef or fish or things that you would only wait until Shabbat to eat. You could eat every day. Why? Because you had more money and things were not that expensive. We will talk later on about kashrut and how even, there were attempts for price gouging, but here consumers said, no more. Give us food and sell us kosher food or meat or things like that at a decent price. And they win.
Yeah, you had noted a couple things that I just wanted to highlight. This is a little bit less on the food side, but just more on the sociological side. You had mentioned the lack of institutions in America. I mean, one of the fascinating differences between Europe and America was that America, sort of had to build up community bottom up in a way that in most places in Europe, right, it was a lot more top down in terms of institutions. And so usually, in major cities or in the shtetl, you would have the rabbi, or in Hasidic communities, the Rebbe, that would really cement a community as a Jewish center. And then people would flock to study with them. In America, it was the opposite, right? People moved places because of either fleeing anti-Semitic persecution or economic opportunity in the case of, say, the Midwest or the West Coast. And then it was only 40, 50 years later, after synagogues had been built, after institutions, that someone would look around and said, maybe it would be easier if we hired a rabbi, right? So the rabbi all of a sudden became sort of under the hierarchy of, say, the synagogue board or philanthropists, in a way that in Europe, it was completely inverted. And so already from the outset in America, and this is certainly the case nowadays, right? Just think about how, the average person talks about a rabbi. Rabbis didn't have sort of their, the same power that they had throughout history, because they were viewed as almost, oh, you're an employee of the board of the synagogue, not this is your synagogue.
Right. And so, And so the idea of, and you know this because we don't have a centralized rabbinic system in America. Okay, there is no chief rabbi of America. That doesn't exist because we have different movements and we have different streams and within the Judaism, which are very predominant in America. So in the beginning, rabbis didn't want to come because they thought this was, oh my God, this is like the worst
Treifa
place to
Medina.
be.
This is, I mean, this is the name in you know, Yiddish Orthodox newspapers. Just for listeners, America was quite literally called the Treifa Medina. Treifa is Yiddish for not or Hebrew for not kosher. And there were actually a lot of, again, predominantly Orthodox rabbis that forbade their followers from coming to America throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s.
And we see, for example, one of a very good source is something which is called the Bintel Brief, which was put out by the Vorwärts or the Forward, which still exists today, mainly in English, and where people say, I want to be kosher, but I can't. I don't have anywhere to be kosher. What do I do? And so the idea, I think, of kosher style became very predominant, like, at my home, I'm going to be kosher. Because I can control this and it's easy. But when I'm out, and many of them were peddlers, many of them, peddled wares and did all kinds of things like that and were merchants, small merchants and things like that. They knew that they couldn't eat, that they didn't eat kosher outside the home. They ate not kosher outside the home. So there was something that very much happened. But what's also important is to say that, for example, take certain foods. When we talk about food, we many times talk about food waste. Food waste meaning what happens to a specific food as it enters a different sphere. Take the bagel, for example. The bagel was a very simple kind of a piece of bread. It was actually the bagel, the historic bagel was really much wider, thinner, and really was nothing there was no way of smearing anything on it, putting anything on it. You just ate it like that. Okay? You ate it like that. When it came to America, all of a sudden there was better flour. They started to add yeast, and all of a sudden the bagel became a little plumper, right? Bigger. And it was only produced at the Lower East Side of New York. Okay, until somebody decided, wait a minute, why all of this? It takes too long. Let's mass produce it. So, and all of a sudden you find yourself in somebody invented a bagel machine, and they did not. And you see, the whole thing about a bagel is that it needs to be boiled, right? So no, this was steamed. So all of a sudden, this was not exactly the same thing, but it was mass produced. And all of a sudden, everybody ate bagel, and all of a sudden, the bagel becomes an American staple, which it wasn't. It was very niche. It was very much in Lower East, the Lower East Side in New York. And the bagel people who made bagels were in a union, and it was very difficult, and to do all of these things. Take the babka as an example, also a very big staple. I went to Poland a few years ago, and I said, it's the homeland or the birthplace of the babka. I'm going to have some babka. Let me tell you something. I was so disappointed. It was a piece of bread with a swirl of jam in it. And this was the truth. You had some leftover dough from the challah. You rolled it out, had some jams, put it in, rolled it out. Hello, babka. They come to America and they see, oh, chocolate. That's interesting. Why do I have to fill the babka with this jam? Let me fill it with chocolate. And voila, the chocolate babka is born. So Jews adopt, but they also adapt all the time. And all of a sudden, they eat much better. Again, very frugal. They go to the 1 penny market. I think it's in Hester, is it Hester Street? One of the markets. and they shop and they buy broken eggs and they, saving, saving, saving. The other thing that we see as well is that once they arrive and they have more opportunity and more means, they insist to feed that the children should eat, and they should eat a lot. And we have this whole concept of feeding children. You must eat because we never had, and now we have, and so on and so forth. So all of this was done like that, but it also very much depended. You need to understand that if you were in the garment industry, you had the high seasons and lower seasons. So when the high seasons were there, all of a sudden you ate better. You had more meat, you had fish, you had variety. When you didn't bring in so much, all of a sudden, you ate soups and you ate things with a lot of carbs in it because it wasn't available. So what we're seeing is, a very clear indication. And so now somebody who was in a lower social position in the shtetl all of a sudden eats like the gvir, like the nobility of the village. All of a sudden they ate exactly the same thing, meat and everything and all the delicacies. It was not just a dream.
And of course, this entire time, because of the poverty that at least, was experienced by almost everybody in Eastern Europe and by most people during those initial years of immigration, there was a lot of methods to preserve foods, which is how we get, the pickle and lox and herring. And, some of my favorite types of foods are preserved Ashkenazi foods. So,
and, Ashkenazi food gets a bad rap because everybody says, oh, it's so gray, it's so this, it has no taste. Wrong. You make an Ashkenazi pickle, when you make a pickle, let me tell you, it's got a kick and it's got a bite and it's delicious.
Generally, I think when people like to dig on Ashkenazi food, it's, the gefilte fish and pacha. We haven't even talked about pacha. Yeah.
Again, I'm coming back. It's the theme I'm coming back to. Food of poverty, the simplest things available. We're using anything available. Take brisket, for example. Everybody says, oh, brisket. Brisket is a tough meat. Why do you think you cook it for 6 hours? Because it's so tough. It's a cheap cut. Again,
so one of the important...
I come back to the same idea.
So one of the important themes here, and then in a second, we'll switch over to non-Ashkenazi food. We've been talking very Ashkenazi for a minute. We'll skip over to the Middle East, and I have a lot of interesting questions there. This period of immigration is also marked by a period of intense secularization among the Jews who came to America. Of course, Jews in America were always more secular than their European counterparts, but especially throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s, most Jews were not keeping Shabbat. They were working in the factory through Shabbat. Most Jews were not caring to keep, strict kosher, but instead, a lot of Jewish food, as opposed to representing sort of keeping kosher, it started to represent Jewish culture. And you can also see this in terms of the way that a lot of Jews practice today. I know, there are millions of Jews, right? It's not an overstatement in America, who do not seem to care about the laws of kosher, right? Say they'll go out and get even a cheeseburger on a weekend, but for special family events, right? Life cycle events, bar mitzvahs, brit milahs, right? Or a shiva, right? When something happens, it's Jewish, they mark it with Jewish food as a way of almost preserving their culture. Now, a lot of times this is sort of degraded by more traditional Jews, as, I've actually heard, one of my rabbis, I grew up in the Orthodox community. He actually had a name he used to call non-Orthodox Jews bagels and lox Jews, right? So this is a, somewhat of a derogatory way. But on the other hand, I think it actually does represent the truth that for a lot of Jews, eating a bagel and lox once a month is actually more of a Jewish thing for them than it would be, sitting in synagogue on a Shabbat morning. Can you just talk for a second how this food and memory have sort of preserved Jewish culture for American Jews when a lot of the more strict either Jewish legal norms or dogmatic norms has sort of long fallen away?
It's interesting to me that everybody hates gefilte fish, yet guess what? as you said, every Rosh Hashanah, it just shows up on the table. Why? Because it's tradition, because we need to eat it. I think to a large degree, what a lot of Jews try to do, and we see this also by the forming of organizations like Bnei Brit, for example, which is a Jewish organization that is not a religious organization, right? And they, and the idea of getting together and getting together for the idea, by the way, of Shabbat, okay, to celebrate Shabbat, a lot of families do this. Yet I have a funny story to tell. When I first came to this country and I was invited for Shabbat and said, I'm sorry, but we've already been invited. Can I take a rain check? And the answer was, no, this is the only week we're doing Shabbat this month. And I was like, what? Like, I came from South Africa, where Shabbat is Shabbat, and it's so traditional, we keep it, and we do all these different things. So what I think is that a lot of Jews see themselves as cultural Jews. They will still eat kosher. So the idea of kosher style is sort of the how should I put it? It's in a way of dealing with this whole idea. I don't want to keep kosher because kosher food, as you know, kosher meat is very expensive. This is very expensive. So we won't mix meat and milk. We won't have cheese. We won't do this, but we will do something to celebrate that particular thing. And so many Jews do this. I will buy, the idea of going to, when I'm in Boston, for example, I always go to a specific supermarket that has all the kosher foods, and I buy certain things that I need to have. I'm not opposed to this. It's just, it's not something that that many people feel very strongly about,
It also isn't very, to take the traditionalist standpoint for a second, I don't think that by itself is a sustainable model of identity. There was actually a really interesting article. I think it was either in Salon or The Guardian. I know those are two very different magazines, but it was in, both sort of left-wing magazines. I actually used this in a while in a course I taught, through Hillel to UCI students. And it was basically titled, Jews are more assimilated and intermarrying at a rate higher than ever. That's a good thing. And one of the lines I'll sort of never forget is this article talked about a lot of the positive facets of Jewish identity. It talked about food. It talked about the sort of humor, which could be a whole other podcast. Talked about a lot of the universal, tikkun olam, social justice-y, universalist parts of our tradition. And the article basically made the argument that all the good parts of our tradition have successfully been assimilated into wider American culture. And so everything that's left is just the sort of rotten particularism that we can dispose of. Now, of course, I don't agree with the article, but it struck me that this is actually an implicit argument. I don't think a lot of American Jews that are more assimilated would explicitly say this argument, but I think implicitly they sort of look around and say, listen, Jews have been very successful in this country. There's, you turn on the TV and you can look at Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David and all these people. You go to the supermarket or go to Starbucks and you can get a bagel. You can turn on,
yes, correct. As David, not David, Jonathan Sarna, who is who wrote an amazing book, by the way, called American Judaism. He says the Jewish project in America succeeded. It succeeded because when you have things like a bagel, which is a typical Jewish thing, which finds itself in the whole if you are in a supermarket in North Dakota, you will find bagels, right? So there's certain things, yes, but then the question is, what else? So we look at Yiddish that has become a big part of American culture too. How many people use Yiddish words in their daily use? A lot. So on one hand, we integrated and we figured this out. I would say very much in the 70s and 80s, even sort of the 90s, we see a lot of Jewish influence on TV and things like that. That waned a bit. We're now in a different period where we're again the Jewish society or Jews within America are all of a sudden looked at differently, and all of a sudden we see anti-Semitism show up again, and all these different things show up again.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
at this point, and then we'll move our way Middle East. I'm not sure if South Dakota is going to stop selling bagels, but Dearborn, Michigan might. But that's moving towards the Middle East. It's funny because all this talk about Jewish food, and I think in the wider American Jewish community, we actually do a very bad job when we say Jewish food, because of course that cuts out half the Jewish community that is not Ashkenazi. Even just in my own experience, my wife is of course Persian, and so going to her house for holidays or for Shabbat or even a regular night, right? The food cuisine is completely different. I'll also add, just for the record, almost always better. But for them, Jewish food, of course, has a completely different meaning, set of ideas. And so I think it is just important to highlight that when we say Jewish foods, generally we're talking about Eastern European Jewish foods. Obviously, the place where non-Ashkenazi food is most prevalent is Israel, which I want to set up with somewhat of a hot take, controversial take, something that bugs me. I'm curious to bounce this off of you. Obviously I've been way too enveloped within the wider media and culture war, proxies of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so, of course, I spend too much time reading news stories, and, really I try to understand any and all sides. And one of the themes that I started noticing already a couple years ago, but I think it's become a little bit more ubiquitous now, is anti-Israel activists contesting the idea of Israeli food. And they say, well, how dare people call shawarma and falafel and sabich and, all these other foods, how dare they say Israeli food? Israel is a, project that only existed 80 years ago. This is clearly, culturally appropriated from the Arab world. My response, and I see you're just, itching to respond here, but I'll just give my response and see if you disagree, agree, have other thoughts on it. Most of the food in Arab countries, Jews, of course, were also living there for thousands of years before, in almost all the Arab countries in the world, before the Islamic Empire even was created. And so to take something like sabich or falafel and to call it an Israeli food, okay, that might not be super precise, but it could still be considered a Jewish food by the same way. And given the sort of collapsing of wider Mizrahi identity into Israeli identity, which is something I might add, they did much more successfully than Ashkenazi Jews in terms of becoming Israeli. I think it does make sense to actually put our foot down and say, no, it does make sense to say there is such thing as Israeli food. And this actually is ancient foods that go back in sort of the Jewish timeline, thousands of years. It's all you.
So I have a lot to say about this. So first of all, I would say that hummus and falafel and shawarma belong to the region. It's a regional food. Shawarma is Turkish. It's got nothing to do, it's not Palestinian, it's definitely not Israeli, okay, per se. Take into account that people lived, that before Israel was Israel, it was Palestine, it was part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, okay, and so influences didn't come into the place because of that. Of course it did. Nobody in Israel pretends to say that hummus is an Israeli invention. It is not. It is within the Arab world. And Israelis, by the way, if they want authentic hummus, will go to the Arab village to have it because they feel that's the best that there is. Okay? So the idea of and I hear this a lot, oh, you took my falafel. And, there was the big hummus wars and falafel wars and all these different things. To my mind, that is rubbish. Simply because it is a regional food. Everybody in the region eats it. Okay? So you're going to say because at the UAE, you eat hummus, they stole it from what? From whom? Everybody eats it. So that's number one. Talking about Sephardic food in general, Sephardic food, again, came into the country came into Israel with the mass immigration from Arab lands. Okay, but here's the interesting thing: it was not consumed publicly. It was consumed in the private sphere. I am what I like to call an Ashkenazi Sephardic. Okay, I'm Ashkenazi because a part of me is Ashkenazi on one side from Germany, on the other side from Morocco. Okay, we ate the traditional Moroccan food at home. Go to a restaurant, you couldn't find it. It was not available. Why? Because within the public sphere, there was this whole idea that Israel is a modern country, a Western country, and as such, we're going to behave and eat Western things. So there was an Ashkenazi influence to begin with, because the leadership was very Ashkenazi. A lot of people who came to the country, the beginning was very Ashkenazi, and so that was brought in. But when the immigration from Arab lands arrived, and I talk not only North Africa, I'm also talking places like Persia or Iran, Iraq, all these different places. I would say within the 80s, towards the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s of the 20th century, all of a sudden there is an explosion of food.
Yeah.
And
Well, this
all of
is
a
super
sudden,
important. I mean, sorry to pause you for a second, just
no,
for listeners thinking about the history of Israel. I mean, as you correctly said before, Israel initially was a secular Ashkenazi project, right? Of course, in the early 1900s, even through the mid
100%.
1900s and the 20th century. But it's clear, right? If you just take a bird's eye or more objective view of current Israeli society, it is clear that the Ashkenazi Jews have lost. I mean, just in the broadest strokes, right? You know, I wrote a list as you were talking, right? You know, food, of course, we've been talking about, right? You walk through the streets of Israel, nobody is selling, you know, gefilte fish or even a bagel and lox. It's very hard to get a good bagel and lox in Israel, right?
No, absolutely, it's impossible.
It's impossible. You listen
Yeah.
to Israeli music and what's on, right? This is not, you know, old-fashioned Ashkenazi music, right? If you look at Israeli music from the 40s and 50s, it was. And now you listen to Israeli music, right? You know, Omer Adam, right, is much more representative of Israeli music, right? Sephardic,
Right.
Mizrahi with religious undertones, right? The politics of the region, right? You know, listeners in America, you know, good liberal Jews such as myself, can endlessly bemoan Bibi Netanyahu, and I am not a fan of Bibi Netanyahu, but if you look at who votes for Bibi Netanyahu, it is predominantly Mizrahi Jews, because the political worldview of Mizrahi Jews is, I'll admit, much more Middle Eastern than my Western liberal political views. It was a great article by Mati Friedman a couple of years ago in Tablet that was talking about this, and he basically says the reason why so many liberal American Jews have trouble understanding Israel is because they don't understand Mizrahi Jewish culture. I think there's a lot of truth there. So the Ashkenazim have lost with food, with music, with politics. They've lost with religion, right? Israel's a much more religious country because of the influence of mostly Mizrahi Jews, and also pop culture. Again, you just look at, right, who do young Israelis want to be, who are sort of the role models in society, the cool, you know, superstars, you know, in, you know, we're not even talking about sports and everything there. It's almost always non-Ashkenazi Jews. And so my argument to this, and, you know, I'm you know, I know we've strayed a little bit away from food, but I think this is interesting, is that Ashkenazi Jews, especially the early Zionists, actually did try to view Israel as a Western country. And still to this day, I think a lot of tension surrounding Israel from America, from American Jews, and from, you know, liberals. Again, I'm putting myself in this category because I am upset personally with the, you know, politics of the region for the last 10 years, but it's because I fully admit I want to project my liberal Western views onto Israel, whereas a lot of Mizrahim came in and said, we're in the Middle East. We've always been in the Middle East. Even, and, you know, this might be somewhat controversial, but I think it's sort of politically obvious, right? You take the idea of Mizrahi Jews for the last, you know, 1,500 years, or really the last 1,000 years, and they were treated as dhimmis all throughout the Middle East. And so what this means,
Second-class citizen.
Yeah, for listeners, is this is a cemented second-class citizen status. So under the Pact of Umar, right, it meant that Jews actually did have some protection, right? It meant that, you know, you can't just go and, you know, have a pogrom on a Jewish village in Iraq. On the other hand, it was accepted as a given that Jews were not equal. And there was a whole set of laws and things that Jews couldn't do, and there had to be deference to Muslim neighbors. A lot of Mizrahi Jews, when the issue of Palestinian treatment comes up, whether we're talking about Israeli Arabs or West Bank Palestinians or Gazans, they don't even understand why people in the Western world are upset at either real or perceived inequality. I've had conversations with friends of mine in Israel. I went to a yeshiva that was split half and half Ashkenazi Mizrahi. And I remember teaching, talking to a lot of, co-yeshiva mates of mine. And they said, who cares about equality, right? We understand, when we came from Egypt, or, even now when Jews right now in Iran walk through the street, they know this is a Muslim country. If we want to live here, we are second-class citizens. So of course, Palestinians in Israel should be second-class citizens. I mean, it's such a different way of viewing it. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but from the predominant Ashkenazi Western, where Jews in Ashkenazi world have been at the forefront of liberalism, and I would argue it's been unequivocally good for Jews, the sort of capital of liberalism.
And I was just in Israel now, and this is exactly a point that was made. Jews in America do not understand what is going on. It's very difficult to understand the Israeli experience because it's so different from what they know. But let's talk about food for a second there. The person behind this whole Western idea was, of course, David Ben-Gurion. And David Ben-Gurion wanted a Western country, so much so that, everything was, there was a lot of motivation to create this. And how did they do this? They would have cooking classes and all kinds of things to teach people how to cook modern, Western food. He wanted us to be, this is funny, but he wanted us to be a country of sandwiches. Because that's what people eat in the West. That's what we need to eat, and so on and so forth. It didn't work. It didn't work because he talked about this smelting pot that he wanted to create. He wanted to create these Israelis who are going to come together, leave behind everything that they know and who they were, and turn into this new Israeli. So what he didn't get a smelting pot, but he got a very nice vegetable salad in which we are all mixed together, but the parts can be seen. And what I mean by this is that Sephardic food worked really well with what was grown in the country. If it's eggplant and peppers and tomatoes and cucumbers and all these different things, why not? It's there. And Israeli food, so had one of the worst raps before the 80s and the 90s, before we became such a food scene. And today, Israel is such a food scene, and you go and you try, I was in Israel now, and I said, I got these very elaborate foods were presented for me. And everything was so, in all these sauces, that, can I just get a schnitzel? Can I just get hummus and pita? That's all I want. Give me something simple, The first thing that I remember when I came to Israel now, I said to my sisters, fresh pita, good cheese, butter, and cucumbers. That's all I want. And what we're trying to do is sort of, Israel is jumping above its own pupik, so to speak, and it's making all these elaborate foods, and there are hundreds of food vloggers who come up with all these ideas, and everybody tries this, try that. This is amazing. I was at a Shabbat lunch at the hotel we were staying at, and you could see what they were serving. It was Mizrahi food, but I did find a gefilte fish hiding there. So I said, I'm going to give it a try, see what this is like. Not good. I did not like it. However, one thing that a lot of Israelis love, and you will find it in a lot of Israeli breakfasts, even in hotels, is herring. Herring survived. And not just one type of herring, 4, 5 different types of herring. And I believe this is because of the Russian influx that came into the country and sort of brought that back. Okay, and people eat herring. So you see all of this. Yes, but if you look at it, the majority of people living in Israel, the majority of Israelis living are Mizrahi Jews. And I'm not saying Sephardic, particularly not, because Mizrahi, this includes not just North Africa or people who were originally from Spain, but it includes the Jews of Iran and Iraq. And talking about Persian cuisine, Daniel, you brought this up earlier. Persian cuisine is one of the most interesting, vibrant, exciting cuisines that have not yet been properly discovered.
Mm.
You
Especially
know?
in Israel.
Especially in Israel.
Yeah, this actually
You know,
is shocking.
yeah, I get, they make you a tadid and they say, oh, tadid, it's a Persian thing. I make, there is in Iranian food or Persian food, there's a lot of greens, a lot of greenery, a lot of green food. So you make like omelets are made with with dill and with all these different things, and parsley and stuff like that. A lot of people don't even know about that. So, and by the way, sabich is not Iraqi. I mean, it was made by an Iraqi person, but it was something that Jews in Iraq did. They made, I think it was, I don't know when they served it, but it was challah with eggplant. That's how it first began. And then it developed in this whole thing. Talking about another thing, a lot of people say, how can you say that the pita is Israeli? No, it's not. But Israelis did something with the pita that nobody else did before. If you eat hummus in the morning, and by the way, hummus is not a dip, it's a meal that is usually eaten in the morning and warm in the Arab villages. You tear the pita and you swipe it and you eat it like that. What Israelis basically said is, wait a minute, let's do something else with the pita. Let's use the pita as a way of holding our food in it. And by the way, if you look there, have you ever seen a Palestinian or an Arab pita as opposed to an Israeli pita? An Arab pita is much thinner and bigger, whereas the Israeli pita is much fluffier and smaller. You open up that pita, you can stuff things into that pita like it's out of this world. So what Israelis basically said, I like the pita, but I'll put stuff into the pita. And that's the Israeli innovation of putting things into a pita. Pastrami in a pita, this in a pita, things like that. Israelis also, when you look at menus today, we talk about the big Israeli salad, which was basically cucumbers, tomatoes, salt, pepper, lemon, and olive oil. Okay? And everybody said, well, this is an Arab salad and it's fatouche and you stole it from us and so on. If you look at menus today, menus in Israel, in restaurants in Israel will say salat Arabi, Arab salad. So there is a return to this idea. No. We borrowed it for a bit. It's this, but really we know it's you. It belongs to you.
Well, there's also a general trend, and I think this goes actually both for the left and the right to sort of reclaim Mizrahi's Arabness. I think, right, on the far left, this manifests by basically saying Zionism itself is a Western colonialist transport, but Mizrahi Jews are there, and usually it's with this historic fiction of, everything was perfect before the Zionists came and ruined it, right? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, right, I think it's used on the sort of pro-Israel right to basically say, we're just as Arab, if not even more than the Arab world. And so, calling it Arab doesn't imply it's not ours. It means it's sort of even more ours. Yeah.
And for the first time ever in 2016, a group came to a musical group called AWA. It's three Israeli cousins of Yemenite descent who sing only in Arabic. Okay, for a lot of the Ashkenazi, or what I like to call the founders, after the war of independence, what do these Jews remind them of? They remind them of Arabs. And hence there is this pushback of, no, we don't want you to integrate. We're not interested in what you have to offer. Adapt. Not assimilate, but, maybe, but adapt. And when all of a sudden you're not allowed to sing in the language that you know, when you're not allowed to sing, when you enter this country, you are looked as somebody without education, where you get the most menial jobs, okay? When you are pushed and like, what can you do? You can either work in the fields, as Awa says in their song, you can either work in the fields or you can clean. That's what you can do. Oh, you don't have a home. You live in a tent with another 4 families, and here I am, and here they are, these Zionists who want to be back in the land, who their dream was to be. By the way, this also happened to Ethiopian Jews.
Sure.
Same idea. And bring them back and to they came from a more religious Zionism, right?
Yeah. Well, this is part of, I mean, what we were talking about before, the political realignment. I think one of the worst things that Israel's ever done, I mean, not I think, I know one of the worst things that Israel has ever done is the treatment of the influx of Mizrahi Jews into the country, starting with the 1940s, but, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There sort of is a tension here because on the one hand, Israel quite literally, I think, saved the lives of a lot of these people. I mean, in the case of the Yemenites and Ethiopians, explicitly saved their lives, all these daring missions into the country.
But there was a price to be paid.
And saving them. On the other hand, the way that they treated Yemenite and Ethiopian Jews, and really, all Mizrahi Jews when they came into the country, was in a second-class citizen type way that obviously, a lot of the laws and culture of Israel have changed in the last 40 or 50 years. But part of, just for listeners to know, the biggest realignment in Israeli political history was in the 70s when Menachem Begin gets elected president or prime minister, and he was the first Likud, right? It was the first time in Israeli history in 30 years of the country where a non-Ashkenazi labor government won. And Menachem Begin, again, just for listeners, fascinating guy. I mean, he was part of the revisionist Zionists and Etzel, right, in the 30s and 40s, which was seen by the labor Zionists as basically being a right-wing militant terrorist group. And so he actually had a wanted sign on his head. Then 25 years later, he gets elected president based off of, right? And this is why I think Americans can't project our own politics onto Israel. Menachem Begin's slogan is he takes issue with the kibbutzim, and he, over and over again, he says, the Ashkenazim and the kibbutzim with their swimming pools, while the traditional Jews and the Mizrahim are, as he said, working the fields and sleeping in tents. He gets a massive percentage of the Mizrahi vote.
He opened the dam. He opened the dam.
And just to finish this history, just for listeners, in the 80s, this then inspires, Shas, which is the ultra-Orthodox non-Ashkenazi party, right? Rev Ovadia Yosef, right? I oftentimes, my favorite trivia question to American Jews about Israel, or really about Judaism in general, I'll ask it. I'll see if any listeners can figure out the answer to this question. What was the most attended funeral in Jewish history, right? And people think about it, and okay, some smarter people might say Moses and the Torah, and I say that's cheating. We don't really know, right? But the most and people guess, right? Maybe Albert Einstein, right? That's an interesting one, right? Louis Brandeis, right? Maybe that's an interesting one. David Ben Gurion, right? Okay, a little bit warmer. It's Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. And half of my listeners at this point are saying, I've never heard of the guy, right? And these are American Jews that are saying, I've never heard of the guy. And then you start to look into him, and he was a Mizrahi Jew who became the first and, the central chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel. He was instrumental in helping cement the Jewishness of a lot of these groups of Ethiopian Jews. It was a big debate. Cultural acceptance, both in the wider society and in the Ashkenazi, more Haredi, ultra-Orthodox society. And when his funeral happened, 10% of the country went to this guy's funeral because he was seen as such an important father figure of the Mizrahi movement. And so just how far off we are. And so even when we're talking about the political realignment, it's because of a lot of what you were saying. The Ashkenazi elite, with their liberalism, is seen by a lot of Mizrahi Jews as, okay, well, we know how that goes, right? It's liberalism for the Mizrahi upper class, or sorry, the Ashkenazi upper class, but what about us?
I'll give you a good example. Here, we're talking about food. There was a type of, I would say in the 70s, even towards the end of the 80s, there was a type of movie and we're talking about food, of course, which was called a Burekas movie. Have you ever heard about Burekas movies?
No, I've heard of
So,
breakfast and I've
okay.
heard of movies, but never the
Yeah,
combination.
so Burekas movies, you know, Burekas is a very popular pastry filled with potatoes or cheese or spinach or mushrooms that everybody likes. So why are they called Burekas movies? Because they were very popular because they followed a formula. Okay? Boy meets girl. Boy is Ashkenazi, girl is Sephardic, conflict. How do we solve this? And the parents are opposed, and these parents are opposed, and they want to love each other, and they care about each other so much, and they're against all odds, they make it happen. And at the end, the bottom line is Kulanu Kol Israel Chaverim. Okay, hundreds of movies.
Just to translate that, Kol Yisrael Chaverim is all of Israel.
All Israel are friends. So what is really interesting is you went to these movies, you knew it was a formula, you knew what was going to happen, and they were so popular. When I lived in Europe, we used to come to Israel every summer to visit, and I would say, is there a new Burekas movie? Is there a new movie we could go see? And they had these names, Nurit, Sarit, it was exactly the same thing, and there was always drama and hardship and hard life, and it sort of figured itself out in the end, and Ashkenazis and Sephardis came together. So there was an attempt to do that, and there was also, in these movies, by the way, there was also portrayal of a Mizrahi, what is a Mizrahi man, and what is, that it's very patriarchal, and all these different things, and Israel is so modern, and how and these things don't all fit together. But yes, and the struggle is not over. The idea that today we are yet to see a Sephardic prime minister. We've seen Sephardic presidents, yes. We've seen chiefs of staff in the army that's a Sephardic. We have yet to see a Sephardic prime minister or Mizrahi prime minister. So, so the idea of, when you look at, we can talk about politics, but you can see this very much within food. Shakshuka? Shakshuka wasn't something you ate. You couldn't go to a shakshuka restaurant. Have you ever heard of Dr. Shakshuka in Yafo? Something like that would never exist. And today you have Iraqi restaurants, and you have these restaurants, and Moroccan food, and you could go and eat every type of food. And when you sit at the Shabbat table, okay, you will have Russian potato salad and Turkish salad and chatzilim, eggplant, and this, and the whole of the Jewish diaspora sits on your table. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect representation of just the wider culinary scene in Israel. I know we've been talking for a long time. I'll say one thing and then I'll let you have the final word. I do appreciate you letting me go on tangents. It's very clear I am not an expert in food, so every time I try to lead you astray to talk about politics or something,
yeah, but I'm happy to jump right in there.
Yeah. No, it's great. You gently nod us back to food. Just in closing, any other thoughts about Jewish food, America, diaspora, Israel, any of these wider questions?
I would say that what we experience today is there is definitely a globalization of these foods. When I had to go to Israel in order to buy a decent pita or to get this, I don't have to do this anymore. It is readily available. And today, I would say we live in a sort of a situation. I see myself as somebody that is more multinational. In other words, I'm on one hand, I live in America. I see myself as an American. But on the other hand, I'm totally a consumer of Israeli foods and goods because they're readily available. When I first came to in this country, 2001, you barely could find I don't know. I remember finding soup almonds for the first time at the supermarket. I was like, amazing. Today, there are stores and you can buy anything and everything you want. Just a fun factor, I was just then one of my nieces asked me to bring her Ritz crackers. She loves Ritz crackers, can't find them in Israel. Okay. So, but everything is available. So globalization also introduced many people to different types of food. Shakshuka is served at our dining hall. Okay, at Elon, North Carolina, a little place in the middle of in the South. Why? Because people like it. Falafel is served daily in our dining halls. Okay, Israeli salad, hummus, all these different things are served on a daily basis for people to consume. They're there. And it is because I think the more we open up and embrace and try different things, it's not my food, your food, it's our food. I'll put it that way, at the end of the day.
Okay. Well, Boaz, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Sure. Happy to be here.